This is U.S. History 2, Chapter 8, Section 1, Adjusting to Peacetime. So the United States entered a brief economic depression after the war. A depression that's a sustained long-term downturn in the economic activity. Many Americans lost their job because the factories, they just weren't producing as many goods as they did during the war. We didn't need just thousands of guns and war supplies and all the food, and it seems like we were feeding half of Europe and everything like that. We just didn't need to produce as much right after the war. So people lost their jobs. And then soldiers coming home from the war, they struggled to find a job because the factories, they gave their job away a lot of the time. And then, sometimes some of them weren't able to get it back, and that just forced another person out. So there was just this economic downturn right after the war for the United States. Labor strikes were really common in 1920, and that is mainly due to after a few years of war production and agreeing not to strike out of patriotic duty. Well, they weren't going to do that anymore. It's not wartime anymore. We don't have to support a war and continue manufacturing. We can go on strikes to demand more pay and better working conditions. Democratic President Wilson, he had served for 2 terms as president, and really the United States was looking for a change in leadership style to adjust to life after the war. So Americans wanted to focus on the United States now. Pretty much for the past 5-6 years, the United States was really focused on Europe during World War I. And the Republican Party did a great job of expressing what Americans wanted and trying to satisfy the American people by promoting a strong, stable economy in the United States and focusing on America first. President election in the 1920 president election, Warren G. Harding of the Republican Party promised a return to normalcy. That was his phrase. And what that phrase is, it means to bring the United States back to the pre-war mentality of peace and prosperity. Let's get back to normal here. We're no longer in war. We don't need to be like this anymore and worry about what the rest of the world is doing. Let's return to normal, peace and prosperity. The Republican president candidate, Harding, he won by a landslide against the Democratic candidate. The Republican Party and President Harding, they promised return to normalcy and American first government. At the time in 1920, Republicans not only controlled the executive branch with the presidency, but also the House and the Senate. And they all pledged to eliminate government spending. There was a lot of government spending during the war, and the budget kind of got imbalanced, and so you can't just spend all that money forever without replacing it. So President Harding had one of the richest men in America at the time, Andrew Mellon. Yes, that Mellon, like Mellon Bank, BNY. It's called BNY Mellon now. But he enlisted him as the Secretary of Treasury to help balance the budget of the United States. Congress also addressed the needs of World War I veterans. Many veterans lost their jobs returning back after service, after being drafted or volunteered. Also, since the United States government budget was so out of balance, many did not receive quite as much pay as they were hoping for serving in the war, and they felt like they were owed money. Veterans were then received adjusted compensation that would really pay the veterans over time. So the United States government couldn't pay all these veterans right away, but like installments. But these veterans could take out loans from banks against this, promised pay, and banks kind of guarantee that. So the United States was greatly in debt and needed help, and so but the veterans needed help. So the Veterans Bureau was created to help veterans with medical care. So the Teapot Dome scandal. President Harding was an upstanding man, but he surrounded himself with some questionable character people that helped him get elected and kind of took advantage of him. And a lot of his advisors that he chose were corrupt. The secretaries of the different departments of the executive branch were corrupt. And they actually had a nickname, this group of men. They were called the Ohio Gang. And just an example, one of these Ohio Gang members, who was the Attorney General of the United States, he was prosecuted for selling government alcohol during Prohibition. That was illegal. So, the government had a supply of alcohol, and he was selling it to people. So that's highly illegal. And they're just these corrupt men. The biggest scandal of all during President Harding's presidency was the Teapot Dome scandal, where Secretary of Interior Albert Fall leased a government-owned oil reserve in Wyoming to these private oil men for a $400,000 bribe. So this oil is not supposed to be touched by anybody but the national government, and he's in charge of federal lands, and he just leases out this federal government land for $400,000 for his personal gain. And a bribe, that's to persuade someone to act in one's favor in exchange for a gift or money, and that's exactly what he did. Highly illegal, and he was convicted of bribery, and he was in prison. The only secretary of one of the 15 major departments of the executive branches to be convicted and put in jail. So this scandal was all over the place, all over the media. So it shows that the reason why it's called the Teapot Dome is because there was this rock formation that kind of looked like a teapot that this oil reserve was on in Wyoming, and so that's why it was called that. Really, it was about oil and leasing out the oil for bribes. So, all these scandals during President Harding's presidency, well, that took a toll on his health, and eventually he died while in office in 1923 of a heart attack. Vice President Calvin Coolidge took over as president after Harding's death. President Coolidge was a serious man. He didn't speak a lot. He was a straight shooter. President Coolidge assisted investigators into various scandals and kind of earned back the trust of the American people by not covering up for these men, and kind of cleaned house, and the American people trusted him for that, and was eventually reelected himself in 1924 and won by a large margin. President Coolidge was known as Silent Cal because he did not behave like many presidents before him and give riveting speeches. He was more quiet and reserved. One time at a dinner party, a woman sat by him and said, "I have a large bet saying that I can make you say more than 3 words during this meal." And he's silent the entire time, and then before he gets up, he turns to the woman and says, "You lose," and walks away, meaning that he only said 2 words, and just proving that he doesn't have to talk. He wanted to be the least president ever. He didn't want to have a lot of power. He thought, the more government involvement in the United States is not good. The less government, the better. And under President Coolidge, the economy did flourish and rebound. But since he was such an inactive president, he kind of missed a lot of things that contributed to the Great Depression that we will discuss later. The Red Scare in the United States during the 1920s, it really got started with the Russian Revolution of 1917. Russia became the first communist country. And really what communism is that it's an economic and political system in which the government controls all means of production and dispersion of goods while only a single political party is in power. Pretty much what communism wants is that everybody gets the same, there's no competition, pretty much the opposite of the United States. The United States is based on competition and freedom of choice. That is the opposite of communism. There's no choices in communism. Everybody gets the same. It's equality. But communism's draw is that no one suffers since everybody has the same. So Russia had formed a new country that swallowed up some little countries, and they formed the Soviet Union under the new communist political party known as the Bolsheviks. The United States refused to recognize the Soviet Union as a new country because communism just went against everything the United States stands for in its core beliefs of freedom and then liberty, freedom of choice. So the United States did not recognize the Soviet Union at first. In the Soviet Union government, the people kind of enjoyed it at first because everybody was, a lot of people were starving, and at least the government would feed them for at least the early years. But it just limited the freedom of choice for all these people. Communism did start to gain wide support in Europe because people were tired of being ruled by monarchs, meaning kings. This is after World War I. That's when a lot of these kings left and were forced out. Communism promised that everyone would be equal. There's no one above, like the king usually was above the law, but that wasn't the case anymore with communism. Even though in reality, in Russia, the leaders of the Bolshevik Party were definitely not equal to the rest of the country's people. That they spoiled themselves. They didn't live like equals. The trade-off of being equal is liberty, and the freedom of choice is taken away. So that's what kind of communism. That's the downfall of communism, is that you just don't have the choices to make what you want to do with your life. Most Americans were scared of such thinking, and they were afraid of a revolution would occur in the United States, just like in Russia. Red was the color of communism, and therefore the fear of it in the United States was the Red Scare. So you're scared of communism, Red Scare. And there was even anti-communism posters in the United States. We'll never change the blue and white to red. So we're going to keep our colors. Just showing how these people want to take over, these communists, and they're bad. The United States, the fear of communist revolution throughout the United States during the era was stoked by these anarchists. Like I said, the fear of communism was a revolution, and anarchists, even though they don't believe in any organized government, they kind of start a revolution. What happened was in 1919, these Italian anarchist immigrants, they came over from Italy, the United States. They sent a series of bombs to prominent politicians, American politicians, and businessmen across the United States, and it was really scary there for a moment. And these anarchists were foreign-born, and this led to further disdain of these immigrants by the majority of American people. So this court case happens in the United States. These two Italian immigrants, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, they were arrested and charged with robbery and murder of these two payroll employees in Massachusetts. Sacco and Vanzetti, they were outspoken anarchists. They were known anarchists, and they did oppose all forms of government, mainly because when they came over to the United States from Italy, they were expecting a land of opportunity, but all they saw was corruption and greed, and that's kind of why they were anarchists. And they did explain that they struggled once they came over to the United States, and that the government really wasn't doing what they were supposed to do. But anyways, during the trial, the prosecution really focused more on the fact that they were anarchists and Italian, which a lot of people didn't like. Their prejudice against Italian immigrants, instead of the evidence that proved that they were actually committed the murders and why they were on trial in the first place. Many Americans felt the injustice that these two men were facing, since there wasn't much evidence that suggested that they did this murder. Protesters gathered around the nation, especially Italian immigrants. The majority of Americans still feared these radical anarchists and foreign-born immigrants, and Sacco and Vanzetti were found guilty in the trial, and they were widely believed to be innocent because of the lack of evidence presented. But since people were afraid of radicals and immigrants, they were convicted of murder and eventually executed in 1927. This fear of the radical anarchists and the Red Scare and communism spreading in the United States, this led to a limit on how many immigrants were allowed in the United States. It was cut down significantly how many the United States were letting in. Citizens were worried that that the American culture itself would diminish if these mass immigration of people from Europe would keep coming into the United States. Capitalism and just the American culture in general would be in danger if all these European immigrants would come over. And also, Americans worried about losing their jobs to these poor immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe that would pretty much work for very, very low pay, lower than typical Americans wanted to be paid. And this political cartoon just shows of the time that they're gonna all these people from Europe want to get in the United States, and there's gonna be a definite limit.